Hi guys. Okay, so we are backtracking and going to cover chapters 3 and 4 in a short little kind of condensed unit. We skipped them earlier this year, remember, so we could go straight into cells and all that fun stuff that you love so much. But I do think that these two chapters are very important, that they are very kind of broad, big picture chapters. So they have to do with more environmental science, environmental studies, ecology, and those kinds of things. The relationship between organisms a a region, populations, all those kinds of things. So a lot of this is going to be something again that you're somewhat familiar with, or that you kind of know about, but possibly not, in the terms that we will discuss it. So again, vocab, vocab, vocab. It's very important in biology, so know what the words mean. Okay, so in chapter 3, the first question is, what makes Earth a good place to live? And so first thing to know is that the biosphere is where all living things are. So on Earth, all of the ecosystems, and whether we're talking about bacteria, all the way up to blue whales, those living things are in the biosphere. And this goes just a few kilometers above the surface of the Earth and a few kilometers below the surface of the Earth. Things above or below that level just can't survive due to pressure, due to temperature, due to lack of oxygen, due to whatever it is. But we're it seems like a huge space, really, when you think about it, but it's really pretty small in terms of the things that we know about as far as our atmosphere and those different things. So it's a pretty limited little area. And as far as we know, in the universe that we know of, the things that we have been able to study through telescopes, which really don't show us that much, but even about some of the space probes and the different things that they have sent out to record measurements and take pictures of different planet surfaces and whatnot. This is the only place that we know of where life, by our definition, exists. So it's kind of cool. Anyway, there is a field, though, that is looking for life outside of Earth, and that is called astrobiology. So if you're interested in those kinds of things, there you go. Now, Earth is pretty special in terms of meeting the needs of living things, and we're in what is called the Goldilocks zone. You remember, the story of Goldilocks. Her porridge had to be just right, and just like her, the Earth has to be in the exact correct position to in relation to the sun. If we were to just a little bit closer, we would burn up in a matter of minutes. If we were a little bit farther away, we would freeze in a matter of minutes. And so we are in that perfect space. Our atmosphere helps us to retain heat even when we are turned away from the sun, when it's night. The temperature does clearly drop, but we stay warm enough because of our atmosphere in time for us to turn back around and get warmed back up. And anyway, it's just it's one of those things that it cannot be a coincidence that we ended up where we did. And so we need to continue to be grateful for God's plan and the fact that He knows what He's doing. Okay. Okay, so ecology is looking at organisms, plants, animals, bacteria, whatever it is, and how they relate to their physical surroundings. So that can be anything from the soil conditions to the atmosphere itself, whether you're at sea level or above, whether you're in water or not, the temperature, just kind of the general things that an organism relies on. And so we have to take into account the fact that organisms have effects on their environment. Of course, in today's age, we spend a lot of time thinking about how humans are impacting the environment. usually not for good. Pollution and those kinds of things are an impact, but it can be a positive also. And so everything affects their environment, and everything is also affected or is reacting to its environment, adjusting to the temperature or the amount of light, or moving because there's not enough food, all those kinds of things. And then we also have to be aware that we affect, or all organisms affect other organisms. And so we'll talk more about food chains and all those kinds of things, but we are not an isolated species, organism, living being. What we do does impact everything around us. So that's what ecology is really dealing with. And so it's what they call a big picture science. So it deals with all the organisms in that area, how they affect each other, how they are affected. And one of the things that is a big deal in ecology is the biodiversity. How many species are in an area, how, in general, the higher the number of species, the healthier an area is considered, the higher the biodiversity. But it really just kind of depends. And so this is a field that is growing, but is also influenced by political opinions, by scientific opinions, of course, by regional feelings, kind of what's going on there. So anyway, you hear goods and bads about ecology, kind of depends on where you are. Okay, so when you are talking about different aspects of ecology, a couple of terms. Again, remember, biology is all about vocab. So first off, biomes. A biome is an area that is pretty consistent as far as the environment goes. And that can be the types of plants that are there, the overall temperature, the rainfall amounts per year. And it is very suitable and very suited for the organisms that live there. It can be very big, continent size. It can also be, somewhat smaller. It just kind of depends on how much it changes compared to other areas. Okay, then we have ecosystems, and ecosystems are smaller than biomes. They're a little more limited area, and now we are dealing more with not only the environment itself, but also the different types of organisms that are there and how they interact. And so under the study of ecosystems, you can look at habitats. And this is the even smaller area that a specific organism prefers. For example, certain birds will make their nests in certain trees. That is their habitat. A niche is the way that organisms live within their habitat, the resources that they use. So the trees that the materials that the birds make their nests out of, the trees that they choose to build their nests in, the food that they eat. So for birds, that could be a certain type of insect, that could be a certain berry, that could be, if they're like owls, the mice that they are hunting. And so the niche is basically like their little area, all aspects of it. Also within an ecosystem, you can look at the non-living aspects. So water, of course, is a big one. The wind, the land formations. Is it a desert? Is it mountains? Is it a beach? The temperature, cold, moderate, tropical. And all of that plays into, again, how the animals and the other living organisms that are there survive and adapt and all those kinds of things. Okay, biotic factors. Those are all the other living organisms in an ecosystem. It can be a food source for the other organisms. It can be a predator, a hunter of the other organisms, whatever it is, all the other living things. And then population, we've talked about a little bit with genetics, but these are the organisms that are all the same species and they interact in the same area. And so as long as they are fairly contained, they're the same, the same species, they would be considered a population. Okay, now like I said, we're kind of skipping over some stuff. So now, still chapter 3, how do these living things interact? And for most living things, it comes down to what do you eat and what eats you. And so producers and consumers are kind of the big categories here. Producers are autotrophs, which is a word we've used before. These are basically the ones that make the food. They make the food for themselves, but they also are consumed. And these are plants and algae that have the ability to do photosynthesis and convert sunlight energy into chemical energy or food. And so those are the producers, kind of the low level base of the food chains. Then you have consumers, and those are the heterotrophs. That's like us. These are consumers of the producers, either directly, like you go out and you pick a head of lettuce out of your garden and you eat it. That is directly eating that producer, or indirectly. If you eat a cow that has eaten that grass, then you're indirectly consuming the producer. And all living organisms, so everything goes back to the energy that the plants and the algae converted for us initially through photosynthesis. And so you have different categories of consumers. You have herbivores, and these animals get their food from plants, so they are plant eaters. Carnivores are sometimes called predators, and these are animals that get their food from other animals, so predator eats prey. And then you have omnivores, and these are animals that eat both plants and other animals. Herbivores we typically think of as grazing animals, cows, deer, gazelles, all those kinds of things. Carnivores, the hunters, the lions, the tigers, the hyenas, the true meat eaters. Omnivores will eat both. One of the kind of typical example of an omnivore is actually like a bear. A bear will eat meat for sure, but they also will eat berries and different types of vegetation. We should be omnivores. You should eat meat and vegetables. I know some of you don't, but anyway, so it kind of depends. And then you have decomposers. These are animals or other organisms, technically, I guess you could put in different forms of fungus and those kinds of things. But these are organisms that break down nutrients from waste. And typically, they are feeding on the detritus of plants and animals, which is basically the waste products. So basically the leftovers of those other organisms. Okay, so now we've got our food chains, our food webs, the pyramid. All of these are basically giving you the same types of information, and it's really just showing how energy is passing from one organism to another. So the food chain, very straightforward. You've got the producer, the grass in that case, and it kind of moves through the different levels of consumers, and they have them labeled as the primary consumer. That's the one that eats the grass and it gets the energy directly. And then you have secondary, tertiary, quaternary consumers. They eat other organisms that have eaten other organisms that have eaten the grass or whatever it is. And so you have kind of that level. Now, what most often happens though is an actual food web where you have the food chain still, but they overlap. And so it's not always, this eats that, then eats this, then eats that, blah, blah, blah. You have kind of a variety in the diet, but notice in the food web there are multiple producers, at the bottom down there, and then there are kind of the primary consumers along with the other levels of consumers. So we're talking about right down here. And then the last one, the ecological pyramid. This one shows the flow of energy also. And it also gives you an idea of kind of the numbers. And notice how the base of this pyramid down here, those are the producers. You need way, way more blades of grass or trees or shrubs or whatever you do need than anything else. They form the base. And if you've ever, been around cows or horses or, these herbivores in particular, these kind of primary consumers, they eat all the time, pretty much. Now, I know they'll lay down for a little bit, but they're pretty much munching away almost constantly. It takes a lot of grass to feed one cow. And that's why that base has to be so big. And then as you get kind of farther away from the producers, you have, fewer numbers. You wouldn't want it to be the other way around. You wouldn't want 20 lions and one blade of grass, it wouldn't sustain itself. And so that pyramid shows not only kind of the levels, but also the numbers. Okay, now on to symbiosis. So how do animals interact within their habitat, either with members of their population or other organisms? How do they relate? And so there are several different categories, I guess is the best word. I will try and give you good examples. Of course, my mind feels blank right now, so hopefully I'll get ones that are kind of understood. Okay, so mutualism. First of all, this is a mutually beneficial relationship between members of a habitat. So this one could be something like, and again, like I said, I can't really think of good ones that are just, super common. But for instance, you guys may have seen like the little videos of the birds that sit on the back of like the wildebeest and some of the bigger grazing animals in Africa. And they are sitting there and they are picking the bugs off or the flies off of the backs of those animals. That is mutually beneficial because it feeds the birds, they are eating the bugs, and it makes the grazing animal, the wildebeest, more comfortable because it is removing these little insects that are biting on them. Okay, parasitism. So one organism lives off of another, which the main organism is often called the host, and that parasite typically harms the host in some way. It weakens its system, or even kind of siphons off some of the energy of that organism through taking some of its food. Something like a tapeworm is a parasite. Not good things for animals or for people to have. So it's internal, and it's basically eating the food that you eat, which means you're not getting all the food that you have eaten, and so it weakens the host. Commensalism. This is where one organism benefits from the actions of another. The second organism is neither helped or harmed. So again, like I said, okay. So one of these, for instance, I grew up, around cows, and we had pasture land. And every summer or so, we would have flocks of birds. We called them egrets. They're just white birds. They look like little storks that would come and be close to where our cattle were. And the cattle weren't really affected by the birds at all, but every time the cows would walk a few steps through the grass to get to the next little place they wanted to stop and eat, they would stir up the bugs. The bugs weren't bothering the cows. But when the cows stirred up the bugs, then the birds would eat. They would kind of wait for these bugs to be disturbed. So the birds were helped because the bugs got stirred up. The cows could have cared less. Let's see, neutralism. These are organisms that share the habitat but don't affect each other. I don't know, this could be almost anything. You may, if you thought about it long enough, you might be able to find a relationship between them. But as far as physically help, two things that are living in the same region, that could be a tree out in a field, like where the cows are. The tree is not affected at all by the cows. The cows might use it for shade, but there's no real no real effect between the two. And then a mentalism, this is when one organism is injured by the actions of another, but that first organism is unaffected. Like I said, I'm drawing a blank. This was the one I was worried about. I knew I couldn't think of a good one on this one. Hopefully I will by the time we're in class together, and I'll think of it then. But so this one, so one organism harms another just kind of, not on purpose, but that without really kind of meaning to. So sorry. Okay, here we go. So now we're moving into chapter 4. So now interacting with the biosphere. So now we're talking about living organisms and then the non-living parts. And so one big thing to look at in this relationship is sustainability. And can that biosphere maintain its balance, or how long can it maintain its balance? And so the more sustainable something is, the longer that balance is maintained. And in the study of ecology, lots of it has to do with the biogeochemical cycles. And so you guys may have talked about the water cycle or the nitrogen cycle. And so this is basically just, like for water example, it falls as rain initially. That rain, runs off into rivers, which run off into the ocean. The oceans or lakes or, the bodies of water are heated up over time by the sun. They evaporate, gather together in clouds, and fall back again as rain. And so it's just constant, like how much liquid water is available at certain times based on that cycle. We go through periods of flooding and droughts and all that. And so that is one of those cycles. And you can cause an imbalance in a biosphere, and the biosphere will work to get back to the balance. Okay, so now populations. So the population density is the number of individuals in a certain amount of space. So how, basically how close together are organisms living. And that population density is limited by different factors. And these limiting factors can limit the growth of a population, and so they can cause the birth rate and the death rate to be unequal, and so like lack of food will obviously increase the death rate, those kinds of things. And so it can these limiting factors can also cause immigration, where organisms move into the area because the environment is more suited for them, or there's more food there, or whatever it is. Or it can increase emigration, which is organisms leaving the area. There's not enough food, I'm going to go other places. And so you see this a lot of times with different animals that migrate over over a season. Some of them migrate as they follow food. Some of them migrate for reproductive purposes, kind of whatever it is, but they affect the population growth. This little map that I have on here, that is the human population in different areas. And notice the darker red and the purple, that's where you have really, really dense areas as far as the human population goes. And if you look, most of them are labeled, and the big ones are the big cities. And so you can see, along the West Coast, San Diego and LA, and then a little further north, Oakland and Sacramento area. And then you kind of have a pretty open area in the Northwest, kind of the Midwest over there. And then notice as you get further back towards the east, things get a little bit more compact again. A lot of that has to do with terrain and with the environment, with temperature. Do people want to live there? And then, we start seeing really compact areas again. We are, right here. You can see Tulsa's labeled right there. We're in one of the little darker regions. We're in this little space up there somewhere. So anyway, so that is population density. This is for people, but they have them for all different organisms. Just kind of depends on what you're studying. Okay, biodiversity. This is, like I said before, the number of species in an area. It is typically used to measure the health of an area, but it can change. And the changes can be caused by natural causes, disasters. A tornado can come through and rip up all of the trees, within, a 5-mile swath, as that tornado runs through. So it can change the number of species there, because not only are the trees affected, different bird species, different insects, different whatevers are affected by that. It can be weather conditions, drought, I already mentioned, floods, just a lack of rain or a lack of water, or whatever it is, can be part of that too. Excuse me. Okay. Sorry, a little break there. Okay, so now other changes in the number of species in area. Human factors, which is just huge. We can't deny that we haven't had an impact. And so the things that we have done that have caused a change in biodiversity, probably one of the main one is habitat loss. We tear down forests, we level areas to build houses, to build malls, to build whatever. So it is definitely an issue if we destroy the habitat of organisms that simply aren't able to reestablish population elsewhere. The overuse of resources, this is, we've cut down a lot of trees. It's one of the reasons that there are lots of organizations that are replanting, that are trying to build back up some of those natural resources. We also sometimes will move a species from one area to another, a certain type of plant, for instance, and if that new plant is detrimental to the current plants, then it can cause changes and hurt certain populations. We also chemically have changed the biodiversity, using too much fertilizer, or dumping your used oil down the drain, and so it gets into a water source, or stuff like that. We just don't know how certain organisms will react. Okay, so now some of the growth stuff. So in some populations, we will see what is called exponential growth. And this is when you have a population growing very rapidly over time. This is not something that can continue, like things don't just keep on growing, because of what they call the carrying capacity. And this is the maximum number in a population that an area can sustain. And depending on what organism you're talking about, it can be the human population, it can be a herd of gazelles, it can be a certain type of bacteria. It all depends on if that organism or those organisms within that population have enough food, have enough space, have enough resources to survive adequately. Once you get past that carrying capacity, once they start to run out of food or space or whatever it is, the individuals in that population will begin to suffer. And so that's when you see parts, some of that population begin to die off. That's when you start to see, just hard things happening, starvation, and those different types of things. Usually living systems follow what they call logistic growth, which is this graph over here. And so you have a fairly rapid growth. You have a pretty quick increase in there, but then once it hits that carrying capacity, it starts to level off. That is what naturally happens. The human population has gone past that carrying capacity simply because of technology and because of our ability to take the environment from other organisms. But we do definitely see areas even amongst humans where there's suffering happening. Okay, last little part, pioneering ecosystems. So what happens from the beginning, essentially? And this picture is is actually a really good picture to me of showing kind of this thing that happens over time. Now it's labeled down here as hundreds of years. It really kind of depends, but you go through these different stages, and the succession is just the change in the biotic community over time, so all of the living organisms in that community. And it starts with primary succession, and this is bare rock, nothing there, nothing that will sustain life essentially until you have environmental factors that play a role. The weather will help to wear some of the rock away or wear it down so it forms soil, or things like flooding will deposit a layer of soil, or a layer that other organisms can grow in or feed on. So you start bare rock, and you have over time, as the soil builds up, as environmentally different things help, you have pioneer species move in, and these are plants and animals that are the first to return to the area. And we're talking really simple, bacteria, very, very small microscopic organisms, plants, things like different fungus, lichen, different organisms that move in, don't need a lot to sustain their life, but do over time have an impact. They break down the soil even more. They provide a food source for bigger animals, and so you start to see secondary succession, and what they call intermediate species come in that are a little bit bigger plants, a little bit bigger animals, and they come in and continue to break down the soil, continue to put down roots and continue to grow until you reach what they call the climax species, or the climax community there in that picture. And this is where you get to, a well-established area with larger organisms, bigger trees, obviously, which means bigger animals, birds, a fox, whatever can live there. And so and they are also species that live a long life. A bacteria is going to have a lifespan of days, whereas a tree in some cases can have a lifespan of 100 years or more. And so anyway, so this study looks at the health of the region and looks at the impacts, all these different things. I think it is super cool, and I think it goes straight back to the dominion mandate of looking at all the things that God made for us and that He put us in charge of, and trying to take really good care of it. So anyway, sorry, I feel like I kind of jumped around all over the place on this, but there you go, chapters 3 and 4.